On the 23rd of May this year, the AFR published an interview with Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy, who outlined the government's priorities in his portfolio for the remainder of 2025. The three major projects he identified were the selection of the C-3000 General Purpose Frigate, further development of the RAAF's Ghost Bat drone, and the selection of a land-based maritime strike platform for Army under Project Land 8113 Phase 2, formerly Land 4100 Phase 2. The Ghost Bat has had plenty of media attention over the past several years, and we've discussed C-3000 plenty of times on this channel, but the maritime strike acquisition has flown somewhat under the radar. In large part, this is probably because the anticipated budget is much lower than the other projects, but in some ways, the selection made here will tell us far more about how the newly re-elected Labour government is thinking about its defence policy than either of the other two projects, because here, the government will be making its first major decision regarding the purchase of a significant American weapon system since the re-election of Donald Trump. In this video, we'll look at Land 8113 Phase 2, the capabilities that the ADF is seeking to add, the contenders, and how we might interpret the government's decision, whichever way it ends up going. To broadly summarise the project, Land 8113 Phase 2 will see the ADF equipped with a capability it has never fielded before, a land-based, over-the-horizon missile system capable of reaching out from the shore and striking hostile vessels hundreds of kilometres away. This will go some way towards fulfilling the objective laid out in the Defence Strategic Review to equip the ADF with longer range fires. At first glance, the utility of this capability would seem to be primarily defensive. Mobile, long-range onshore fires could be distributed throughout Australia's northern approaches or near major harbours and ports further south under particularly dire circumstances to generate no-go zones for hostile vessels approaching the Australian mainland as a supplement to RAAF anti-ship firepower. This approach has some advantages. As land-based assets, these could be deployed far more flexibly than fixed-wing assets, and are completely independent from runways and other fixed infrastructure. Indeed, this is how such systems are typically employed in Europe. Ukraine famously made use of the land-based Neptune missile in the sinking of the Russian cruiser Moskva, pushing the operation's safe zone for Russian naval assets well back from Ukraine's coastline. In Australia's case, however, this is unlikely to be the doctrinal approach that the ADF would take. For one thing, Australia is simply too big. While a sufficiently large number of land-based missile systems could plausibly cover the entire coastline, maintaining the logistical supply lines to keep all of these launches armed and active would be extremely challenging. More to the point though, allowing hostile forces to get close enough to the coast would go against much of what the ADF has historically sought to do in keeping the fight well away from the Australian mainland. It's far more likely that these assets will be employed more aggressively as part of the Army's transition to a littoral focus. In an actual conflict, Army's long-range anti-ship fires will instead most likely be forward positioned around key choke points in Australia's northern approaches. Inserted quietly onto any one of the thousands of the region's islands, these assets could intercept or harass hostile naval assets as they transit the archipelagic waters to Australia's north, well before they reach Australia itself, utilising their mobility to stay hidden potentially for quite long periods of time. This would go a long way towards balancing the PLAN's widely publicised numerical superiority over Allied navies. It is true they do have more hulls in the water than any other naval force could realistically expect to maintain in the region. But it's also true that many of those vessels are very small. Corvettes and fast attack missile boats optimised for green water littoral operations, but which nevertheless mount enough anti-ship missiles to pose a serious threat to larger ships, especially if operating in groups, making them effectively weapons of sea denial. Such ships would be prime targets for land-based fires, as they are often far more offensively than defensively oriented, and could very much be put at risk by even the relatively small volumes of missiles that land-based systems can fire between reloads. Moreover, with a primarily anti-ship armament and limited organic intelligence capabilities, they would likely struggle to fire back against highly mobile land-based systems, even at relatively short range. Other potential targets might include hostile military vessels passing incidentally through the archipelago, or cargo or other ships bound for the Chinese mainland. But these systems could also hold at risk any ships sent to support or resupply hostile land forces operating in opposition to Australian Army troops. In this way, such assets could contribute to an Australian version of something like the US Marine Corps' Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations, or EABO, doctrine. To quote the Marines' manual for EABO, EABO are a form of expeditionary warfare that involve the employment of mobile, low signature, persistent, and relatively easy to maintain and sustain naval expeditionary forces from a series of austere, temporary locations ashore or inshore within a contested or potentially contested marine area in order to conduct sea denial, support sea control, or enable fleet sustainment. Missions of EABO include support sea control operations, conduct sea denial operations within the littorals, contribute to maritime domain awareness, provide forward command, control, communications, computers, combat systems, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, also known as C6ISR, as well as targeting and counter-targeting capabilities, and providing forward sustainment. Now, the Australian Army doesn't have all of the assets or capabilities to undertake the full suite of missions that the USMC envisions under EABO, which includes everything from forward armament and refueling or forward ISR to full-on air defense and anti-submarine warfare. But that doesn't mean that Army can't offer a massive contribution to a littoral campaign, especially once long-range anti-ship fires are fully integrated. Critical to this strategy will be Army's new fleet of medium and heavy littoral manoeuvre vessels, which will be used both to insert and move these assets around, as well as to support them once they're inserted. Between these two projects, the Australian Army could support sea denial operations throughout a vast area of geography. Moreover, there's nothing theoretically stopping these weapons from being fired not from land, but from the deck of one of those Army watercraft, potentially giving them the ability to undertake an entirely different kind of mission, though limited air defense will restrict those missions to a very specific set of circumstances. So, in summary, while defensive operations will always be an option for land-based fires, Australia will likely see far more utility in offensive deployments of these assets into austere forward operating positions in the archipelagic waters to our north. In order to undertake that mission, any platform acquired needs to be highly mobile, easy to maintain and reload, and capable of delivering a dangerous strike at long range with a decent chance at evading naval defences. So, let's look at the two contending designs that have made it to the final stage. The competition is currently between two options. Lockheed Martin is offering the American-made M142 HIMARS launcher equipped with the Precision Strike Missile, or PrSM, while Thales Australia and Kongsberg have teamed up to offer the Strikemaster, a modified Bushmaster PMV equipped with a pair of Naval Strike Missiles, or NSMs. Let's begin with the American offering. The M142 HIMARS, the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, has gained notoriety over the last several years for its highly successful role in the Ukraine war. But in fact, its operational service with the US Army goes back to 2005, making the system very mature. Essentially, the HIMARS takes one of the two rocket pods which equip the M270 MLRS and mount it on a wheeled truck rather than the tracked M270. This makes the system highly mobile and relatively light, while retaining the diversity of armaments which equip the M270. Each pod, so each HIMARS, can hold a total of either 6 GMLRS multiple launch rockets, 1 ATACMS tactical ballistic missile, or two of the new precision strike missiles, or PrSM, a more modern ballistic missile on which Australia has been partnering with the US since 2021. It is PrSM which is being offered to Australia in the maritime strike role. PrSM has been developed to replace the ATACMS as a more modern, more capable tactical ballistic missile, and is being developed in stages or increments. Increment 1, which is currently in use by the US Army, is a conventional surface-to-surface tactical ballistic missile with a 90-kilogram warhead, which was built to comply with the now defunct Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty between the US and Russia. This treaty limited America to ballistic missiles with ranges of less than 500 kilometers, and Increment 1 PrSM, at least on paper, has a 499-kilometer range accordingly. However, the US abandoned that treaty in 2018, which has paved the way for significant upgrades to be made to later iterations of PrSM. Increment 2, which Australia has already committed to purchase to arm its existing HIMARS regiment, will equip the missile with a far more advanced multi-mode seeker, which will, amongst other improvements, give PrSM the ability to hit moving targets at sea, making it a true anti-ship ballistic missile. This capability was first demonstrated in 2024, with two PrSMs hitting the ex-USS Cleveland, an Austin-class amphibious transport dock, while it was moving during a syncax. Later PrSM increments will see further improvements to diversity of payload and most critically to range. Increment 4 is anticipated to have a range in excess of 1,000 kilometers. Competing with the HIMARS is the Strikemaster, a modified Bushmaster protected mobility vehicle equipped with a twin launcher for the Norwegian-designed Naval strike missile. Like the HIMARS, though to a much lesser extent, Bushmaster has also gained something of an international reputation following its performance in the service of the armed forces of Ukraine, where they have acquitted themselves well, demonstrating their substantial degree of protection and prioritization of crew survival. Domestically, of course, the Bushmaster, which is manufactured in Victoria, already had that reputation. Over 1,300 have been delivered, mainly to the ADF, but also to overseas customers, making it, again like the HIMARS, a highly mature and proven platform. The Naval Strike Missile, or NSM, is a modern, stealthy anti-ship cruise missile designed by Kongsberg. The NSM is replacing the old Harpoon missile across many of its airborne and naval applications throughout multiple militaries worldwide, including Australia and the United States. The NSM is a subsonic missile, but uses its stealthy design and reliance on passive sensors to significantly reduce its detectability to hostile sensors, increasing its likelihood of achieving a hit relative to the legacy subsonic systems like the Harpoon. It has a stated range of over 185 kilometers and has a 120 kilogram warhead. The two systems are both highly competitive in the ways that actually matter. In both cases, the logistical burden is simplified by the fact that the ADF already operates the underlying platform, with the Bushmaster PMV making up a big part of the Army's motorised infantry fleet, while HIMARS is currently being acquired to equip the 10th Brigade out of Adelaide. Similarly, both munitions either already are in service or soon will be. NSM is being fitted to the Naval Surface Fleet, and the RAAF currently uses them on its Super Hornets, with plans to equip them onto both the P-8 Poseidon and the F-35 once integration is complete. PrSM, meanwhile, is being co-developed by Australia and the US, with Army intending to arm its HIMARS with the weapon as soon as possible, regardless of the outcome of the naval strike competition. Onshore manufacturing of munitions is also happening. Under the GWIO initiative, Australia is currently constructing a factory to build NSM near RAAF Williamtown in Newcastle, and while PrSM is not currently officially part of that initiative, there's every indication that it will be one day. Australia and the US signed an MOU on the sidelines of the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore just this month, establishing a framework for Australian participation in the PrSM supply chain and eventually domestic manufacture of the missile. The two vehicles are also hard to split on mobility. They're both wheeled platforms rather than tracked, with the FMTV truck on which the HIMARS is based being 6x6, while the Bushmaster is a 4x4. In terms of transportability, HIMARS is deceptively light at 16 tons, and Bushmaster is deceptively heavy at 12.5, though that's before modification into the Strikemaster, which may add some weight. They're both air mobile, and given similar dimensions of about 7 meters long and 2.5 meters wide, pretty much any platform that can take one will more or less be able to carry the other. And so, if the platforms are too close to split, then we have to consider their munitions, and that's where the lead really starts to open up for HIMARS and Prism. Obviously, the range advantage is huge. Naval strike missiles' stated range of over 185 kilometers almost certainly understates its actual performance, but not by so much as to close the gap with Prism. Even assuming the Americans were scrupulously honest and above board with the INF Treaty, and the Block 1 Prisms really do top out at exactly 499 kilometers, the later blocks that Australia has committed to buying will go far beyond that distance, even if the upgrades to the early model increment 2s aren't focused primarily on range improvements. Now, range is not a bad thing, but we shouldn't get too enamored of it either. It's likely that shots taken at the extreme bleeding edge of any missile stated range are going to be few and far between, not only because it increases risk and difficulty of making any given shot, but more importantly because the further away you are from your launcher, the harder it is to maintain a weapons-grade targeting solution on a moving target, as well as the secure communications links required to keep that lock relevant to the missile. It's far from impossible on today's technologically enabled battlefield, but it's definitely harder, particularly for Australia operating independently, given our relative underinvestment in long-range drones capable of this kind of ISR. Obviously though, at the end of the day, you'd still rather have the range and not need it than the other way around. So that's a big tick for the HIMARS. But I'd argue that the more significant benefit comes not from the range of Prism, but by its mode of attack. Before the war in Ukraine and the fight against the Houthis in the Red Sea, you more or less have to go back all the way to the Falklands War in the 1980s to find the last significant naval conflict between any two forces that could even remotely be called peers. In large part because of the scarcity of examples, though, it has been the lessons learned from the Falklands that have dominated naval ship design for, essentially, the last 4 decades. In practice, this has meant that surface ships have been designed around two things: aircraft launched from carriers, and the anti-ship cruise missiles launched from those aircraft, as well as from other surface ships. These weapons have evolved over time, growing faster, more stealthy, and generally more lethal, while in turn, defenses against them have also grown increasingly sophisticated and capable. A large modern surface combatant, such as an air warfare-focused destroyer from a first-rate navy, has a layered air defense capable of integrating with airborne sensors to target incoming missiles and reaching out well past the horizon with interceptors launched from vertical launch system cells. If those don't work, shorter range interceptors from those same cells provide additional protection, which are themselves backed up by missile and gun-based close-in weapon systems. Even the main deck guns of ships these days are capable of downing incoming cruise missiles in a desperate enough situation using specialized proximity-fused ammunition. Smaller ships will typically scale back these defenses as they shrink. Frigates, for example, will often give up the longest range interceptors, while corvettes and missile boats may give up VLS cells altogether, but retain specialized close-in gun and missile-based CIWS systems as well as their main guns. This limits their area air defense capabilities, but maintains their self-defense capabilities against cruise missiles, making them tough nuts to crack, even for highly advanced, stealthy missiles like the NSM. This whole sophisticated, layered defensive architecture falls apart, however, when the threat comes not from cruise missiles, but from anti-ship ballistic missiles. The Seekers and long-range ISR capabilities to enable these weapons to be accurate are relatively modern innovations, but as they disseminate, they are having massive disruptive effects on naval doctrines and balance of power. It is the ASBM which is at the heart of China's A2AD complex in the South China Sea, which will likely force US carriers to operate significantly farther back from the shore than they were ever designed to. The US Navy only has two missiles, the SM-3 and the SM-6, which are designed for ballistic missile defense, in the mid-course and terminal phases respectively. But these weapons are among the most expensive SAMs that the US has, and aren't yet equipped in large numbers on most of their ships. On the Chinese side, information is harder to come by in English, but weapons like the HHQ-9 appear capable of BMD, though with the naval variants being perhaps somewhat less capable than their land-based equivalents. Again though, like in the US fleet, these weapons are far from ubiquitous across the PLAN, being mainly restricted to the largest and most modern destroyers. The frigates and missile boats which make up the numbers in the Chinese fleet are often equipped with HQ-16s, a far less capable missile derived from the Russian Buk, a system which has no BMD capability, or even just the HQ-10, a missile-based CIWS system comparable to the US's CRAM, and again ineffectual against ballistic missiles. In simple terms, that means that a significant percentage of the Chinese fleet will have effectively no organic defenses against anti-ship ballistic missiles like Block 2 PrSM. Yes, in theory they can blind ISR assets to prevent targeting or undertake maneuvers to increase the odds of evading a hit. The few examples we have seen of ASBMs in operation have been highly inaccurate. But we have to consider that A, these are being operated by the Houthis, not exactly a first-rate national military, and B, even despite that, their accuracy has been improving over time. No matter what you might think of America, I think it's safe to assume that their ASBMs are probably going to outperform the Iranian cast-offs that the Houthis are using when it comes to accuracy. And if that is the case, then PrSM offers an incredible opportunity. If paired with capable, long-range ISR assets, a single PrSM launcher, equipped with Increment 4 missiles, could, theoretically, mark out a circle of territory roughly 2,000 kilometers across, within which certain classes of Chinese ships simply could not operate without exposing themselves to ballistic missile fire against which they would have absolutely no capability to defend themselves. One of these launchers, placed in Darwin, could reach out not just into the Timor Sea, but deep into the Banda and Arafura Seas, extending that no-go zone for smaller Chinese warships into huge parts of Indonesia's archipelagic waters. Another one on Christmas Island would not only threaten the Sunda Strait, but deep into the Java Sea. In fact, under a best-case scenario, and assuming we were able to access Lobram Naval Base on Manus Island and RMAF Butterworth in Malaysia, which I realise is far from guaranteed, then just 8 of these systems could effectively threaten not just our northern approaches, but most of the Southeast Asian archipelago to our north. Now, obviously, I'm not going to pretend that that's a particularly realistic scenario. It assumes away a lot of very serious issues around targeting, on the ground and atmospheric conditions which might impact range, political and diplomatic access, and enemy counterfire. I fully acknowledge that it is a hell of a lot easier to draw some circles on a map than it is to position a launcher, identify and track a target 1,000 kilometers away, and then accurately hit that target while it's moving and actively trying to evade, even if it isn't necessarily firing off interceptors. So it's only ever likely to be theoretical. Also, just because some Chinese surface vessels lack BMD capabilities, obviously not all of them do. Distributing these weapons around maritime Southeast Asia won't stop larger and more capable vessels from operating in our northern approaches. But if those high-value hostile ships are busy doing that, then that means they're not doing potentially more useful things, like defending Chinese carriers or large-deck amphibs against American, Japanese, or Taiwanese air power closer to home. Essentially, in a wartime scenario, by deploying a large number of highly mobile, accurate, long-range anti-ship ballistic missiles, the ADF could force the Chinese surface fleet to make a choice in a way that anti-ship cruise missiles, no matter how advanced, can't force them to make. Faced with the ASBM threat, they can either accept the risk of catastrophic losses amongst their less capable combatants, cede those waters to Australia and its allies, or spread their more capable forces thinner, eating away at the local numerical advantage China is likely to boast in any conflict over Taiwan, and commensurately improving the broader strategic situation in what is likely to be the decisive theatre of any war in the region. Now, that's not to say that the Strikemaster and the NSM would necessarily be useless or even a bad choice. Simply that, by its nature as a cruise missile, it can't have the same deterrent effect as its competitor. So, HIMARS and PRISM seem like the better option, on paper. But there are three big elephants in the room that absolutely need to be considered. The first is, as always, cost. International orders for the HIMARS have varied, and include a bunch of other equipment beyond the launchers themselves. The pods which fire the missiles, the resupply vehicles which carry ammunition and rearm the launchers, sometimes the ammunition itself, and any training and support offered by the Americans. The headline per unit figure varies depending on the contract you look at, but it's safe to assume that an all-up HIMARS will run the Australian government somewhere between about 50 and 70 million a pop once all that is accounted for. If we assume that the new Maritime Strike Regiment will have 42 launches, the same number as the 14th, which is currently set to operate HIMARS, we're looking at a $2.5 billion acquisition price. The Strikemaster, I think we can be very confident, is not going to cost quite that much. Bushmasters today run the Australian government roughly $2.5 million a unit. Now, of course, the launches and any development costs will add considerably to that figure, and just like HIMARS, any contract would likely include some kind of reload or support vehicle fleet as well. But it's very challenging to see Strikemaster getting anywhere close to HIMARS numbers, even accounting for that associated equipment, and that's before even considering any economic multiplier effect or tax receipts that the government receives from stimulating the local economy. So, cost is probably going to favour the Strikemaster, whether that means a lower overall project cost or a larger fleet. Second, we have to consider the Australian domestic defence industry and its associated jobs. As of today, June of 2025, NSM and Bushmasters are both either already built here or we're building the facilities needed to build them here. HIMARS and the Precision Strike Missile aren't, regardless of any future plans around PRISM. Buying from overseas takes all the cash set aside for this program and injects it into other economies rather than our own. This is always a consideration when acquiring new kit, but it hasn't always been an overwhelming one. The Australian government has certainly never been shy about importing defence equipment, so it's not likely to be their sole overwhelming concern here either. While an order of Strikemasters would be great for Thales and Bendigo and provide them with a serious boost to a new product line which they could then market overseas, if that order never materialised, it would hardly be a fatal blow to the company. The government has a habit of keeping the Bushmaster line hot with penny packet orders, and given potential interest from the Kiwis and the Poms, I think it's very safe to assume that they would keep that up for at least the next few years to ensure the line is available if and when those foreign orders come in. So, while there would certainly be some political blowback on the domestic industry front if Strikemaster lost the competition, it wouldn't come close to the blowback they would receive on the broader geopolitical front, which is where point number 3 comes in. It's hardly groundbreaking analysis to say that the United States in 2025 is very much not the same country it was 10 years ago. With the re-election of Donald Trump, we've seen America move from a position of relative predictability, at least where their rhetoric towards allies was concerned, to one of complete disarray and destabilization, with a president who swings wildly from day to day, imposing tariffs just to remove them again a few weeks later, disparaging allies while cozying up to dictators, and introducing enormous doubts amongst their NATO allies as to America's commitment to its treaty obligations. Now, you as an individual can obviously believe whatever you want politically, and you can have your own opinions about whether Trump's policies are a net positive for America, but I don't think that there's really much room for debate that it's a real problem for Australia. The US is our major security partner and, along with New Zealand, one of only two formal Australian allies. For all the positivity and confidence in that alliance that both sides of politics wanted to project during the recent election campaign, nobody in Canberra is so naive that the real doubts that these recent American actions have introduced regarding their reliability as a defence partner and arms supplier are going to be entirely ignored when considering future purchases. Obviously, walking away wholesale from the American alliance, as much as it seems to be a popular position online, would be patently ridiculous. You only have to glance at Australia's aircraft fleet, or its naval missile armament, or its global intelligence capabilities, or any number of military sectors for that matter, to see exactly how dependent we are on US weapons and US supply chains. But just because we're currently in that position doesn't necessarily make it a good idea to deepen our dependency in yet another field. And if there's disquiet on this front amongst the decision makers, and there almost certainly must be, there is much, much more disquiet amongst the general public. The perception of Trump in Australia and the America he leads is truly woeful. In March of 2025, polling by the Australia Institute suggested that nearly 1 in 3 Australians considered Trump the largest individual threat to global security, higher than either Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin. The same polling indicated that essentially half of Australians were not confident that Trump's America would come to Australia's defence if we were attacked, and 44% wanted a more independent foreign policy versus just 35% who wanted stronger ties with the US. Another poll, just about 2 months later, found that that number was as high as 66% wanting more independence from the US. Combined with the recent election result, which has certainly been portrayed by some as something as a referendum on Trump, and you have a strong political incentive to avoid prominent, big-ticket American arms deals. Now, personally, for whatever it's worth, I don't think that Trump was quite as big an electoral factor as some in the media, particularly the US media, presented him as having been. But I do think that the point stands. Australians aren't clamouring to cozy up to the US right now, and a major weapons purchase from them, especially one which was made at the expense of a domestic alternative, is going to go down like a lead balloon with the Australian public. After their massive election win, the Albanese government could certainly do it and get away with it, but why would they want to spend their political capital on that particular decision? And that's why I'm so fascinated by this particular upcoming choice. Australia's doctrine calls for a small but extremely well-trained and well-equipped defence force, which can slot seamlessly in with our great and powerful friends. Especially when it comes to prestige capabilities, we've never been shy about spending big to buy the very best. Just look at the composition of the RAAF, for example. If we maintained that way of thinking, HIMARS would have this competition wrapped up. It's likely to be more expensive, but it offers greater range, more challenging interceptions, and would ensure the hand-in-glove interoperability that Australia and the US have spent decades developing at this point. But choosing Strikemaster would be a departure from that way of thinking. A lesser capability at a lower unit cost, but with that money being invested into Australian products and Australian industry. And perhaps most important of all, it would be a very subtle and gentle step out from under the American shadow. At this point, we probably don't have long to wait. Per Pat Conroy, this is a priority for the government, so I think it's safe to assume we'll see a decision this year. As for a prediction, I honestly don't know. I think this is going to come down to some pretty fundamental questions about how the Australian government perceives the level of risk from China versus the level of risk from America, what it really thinks the world is going to look like over the next few years, and other things that they're going to go to great effort to hide behind spin and diplomatic language. It might even end up being a bargaining chip that the government is willing to put on the table now that this review into AUKUS has been announced. Gun to my head, I think they maybe go Strikemaster, but that's about as low conviction a pick as is possible to give. When they do make a decision though, pay attention. It will tell us more about Australia's strategic positioning than most people are going to realise.